Ever heard that neuroscience holds the potential to unlock your potential? Well, I love neuroscience. I've been studying neuroscience for a very long time. I even have this silicon brain here. But what can neuroscience really do for us educators, teachers, learners in general? Does it really have all the answers? Doesn't it create distorted versions of what really happens? So this is what we're going to talk about today. I hope you're excited. Let's get to it. Well, first, if we are going to talk about neuroscience, we have to define neuroscience. Do you know what neuroscience studies? Well, if we think about the most common terminology, neuro has something to do with the brain, right? So neuro is really related to the brain. But neuroscience doesn't just study the brain. Neuroscience studies the central nervous system, and that's the brain, but also everything else related to the peripheral nervous system. And that includes our spinal cord, for example, and all of our nerves that extend to different parts of the body. If that's what neuroscience studies, then we have to ask ourselves, how does neuroscience study anything? Well, one of the most common ways, especially nowadays because of new technology, is through some neuroimaging advancements that we accomplished as a human race, and it's really cool actually. So there are different techniques we can use to study the brain and how it works when we are doing something. I'll give you a couple of examples. You may have heard and you may have even done some of those tests, you know. So the very first example is the PET scan, and that stands for positron emission tomography. So basically what happens is that you are injected with some radioactive stuff in your brain. How cool is that? So that the machine can actually follow that flow inside and see what's going on as you do some tasks. You may have also heard of an fMRI, and that's the functional magnetic resonance imaging. And this one looks at the blood flow inside your brain. So if you have to do anything that requires more oxygenation, that means that your blood will go there to that specific area in your brain so that you can accomplish a task. We can also use the EEG, or electroencephalography, and that basically requires the subject to wear sort of a helmet with electrodes that will measure the electrical activity of our brains. That's right, our neurons communicate through electricity. How cool is that, right? But we have other techniques, and I'm going to mention just one more. It's the MEG, or magnetoencephalography. Whoa, that's pretty cool. And that measures the magnetic fields created inside your brain because of all of the electrical activity. I mean, how amazing is that, right? But then, of course, there is a problem. Well, and the problem is whenever we create an experiment to be conducted in a lab or a medical center where you can actually get access to those very expensive machines, we have to be able to control a lot of the variables, right? I mean, we have to make sure that what is causing the outcome that we can see in the scan is not something else that we haven't really thought of. So that means that we have to make things kind of simple in a way. Let's say I want to test if you can memorize things well. So I give you a list of words or maybe a list of numbers, and then I'm going to put you inside an fMRI, and then you are going to have to retrieve those numbers or words, and then I'm going to check what's going on inside your brain. So I have to make sure that nothing else is interfering with that so that I can actually generalize my results. Now, does that resemble, or does that actually feel like anything that goes on inside a classroom? Well, we cannot really control the variables in the classroom. There are many other things going on at the same time, so we cannot really just say that something is based on neuroscience, so it's transferable or applicable immediately to classroom practice, because it doesn't make sense, right? I'm not saying we should discard neuroscience. I mean, you know me, I love neuroscience. I think neuroscience has answered a lot of important questions. But what I'm concerned with is when people use neuro jargon to say that they have found a revolutionary way to make us learn with very easy steps, like 5 easy steps to learn English in 2 days. Or if you follow this neuro whatever, you are going to be able to cut through months of study and actually be able to achieve an unprecedented level of English or something like that. Well, we have to be very careful when we see stuff like that, because neuroscience alone might not hold all the answers. As a matter of fact, I do believe that neuroscience can communicate with other areas, and those areas are as important as neuroscience. So neuroscience should be talking to psychology and ask psychology, okay, psychology, I found something very interesting in the brain when somebody's doing something. Do you have a theory or something to explain this? And then psychology will go like, oh yes, I do have a theory about this. So maybe it makes sense. But we also have to ask education. So education, what do you feel about that? Especially practice, like experience inside the classroom. Because, if somebody comes from neuroscience and tells an educator, hey, I know everything about the brain, so if you do this, according to what I know about the brain, you will be better able to teach your students, then they will learn more effectively. Well, maybe this educator should ask the neuroscientist, what do you know about teaching? Have you ever taught in your life? Because it's a very different environment. Come on, let's agree, right? So here's a tip for you who wants to use neuroscience, but in a better way. I'd say, well, not a better way, but in a cautious way, because we have to be careful about propagating stuff we don't really understand. How about you take a look at Tracy Tokuhama's book, Making Classrooms Better, 50 Practical Applications of Mind, Brain, and Education Science. So mind, brain, and education. It's not just neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience. You also have cognitive psychology. You also have educational research to say, hey, neuroscience knows this. What does psychology know about this? What does education know about this? So let's look at all of those things together and make an assumption about how something works. But even if you are based on mind, brain, education, you also have to be careful, because sometimes it's really hard to measure certain things. Or maybe we can't get very good quality evidence. The data that we have access to doesn't really tell us what is going on, because there are biases and there are, problems with the machinery that we are using, for example. Or if we do, a questionnaire, and then somebody answers something, we know that maybe they were not being fully upfront. Maybe they were not honest about the answer they gave us. So all of those things tell me one thing. Neuroscience alone cannot do much. Of course, it has brought us to this incredible level of understanding about how we learn, because the brain is the organ that we use for learning and for everything else, actually. So sure, we should know more about neuroscience. We should know more about processes that are directly involved with the learning process. For example, attention, memory, focus, language use, emotions, all of those things are directly involved with learning. And neuroscience can tell us a lot about those things. But neuroscience cannot give us a formula, a magic formula, that will always work for everyone, no matter which conditions they are under. So we have to be very careful. Once again, I've said it a million times. Let us be careful. And you know what? I will have to confess that I myself have said on occasion that, you know what, neuroscience can revolutionize education. Maybe it can, but nowadays I'm not so sure anymore, because the more I study, the more questions I have. I guess Socrates was the one who said, I know that I know nothing, so let's keep asking questions. For now, my advice for you is the following. Read books about neuroscience, about how neuroscience can be applied. So if you are an educator looking for something different to do, try to understand the underlying processes when it comes to learning. I have two amazing tips for you actually. The first one is, my professor Paul Howard-Jones, Evolution of the Learning Brain, or How You Got to Be So Smart. And he really explains some of the most elemental mechanisms of the brain and why we have such amazing brains. So you should definitely read this one if you can. If you're in Brazil, it might be hard to get a copy, but maybe you can check out my blog and see a couple of things I wrote about this book. But there's another great book by a French neuroscientist, Stanislas, and how we learn, why brains learn better than any machine for now. You can take a look at that, and then you will see that he talks about 4 pillars of learning: attention, engagement, error feedback, and consolidation. You can also check out some books that are actually based much more on cognitive psychology than cognitive neuroscience. So you can go to Make It Stick. I'm sure you've heard about this book. And you can also go to, ta-da, this is a great book by Benedict Carey, and it's called How We Learn, basically. And it goes through a lot of research about memory, attention and memory especially. And I think you're going to benefit a lot from reading those books. So I hope this video was able to answer the question, does neuroscience hold the answer? Well, I think neuroscience is amazing, but neuroscience needs to check with its friends, psychology and education now and then. So my final tip is, instead of just going to neuroscience, why don't you check Mind-Brain Education, MBE. By the way, I'm the board member of the Brastiso Mind-Brain Education SIG, so you can follow us on Instagram and Facebook. We promote events about neuroscience, psychology, and education. And you can also check things like educational psychology or educational neuroscience or neuroeducation or psychology of education. That's what I studied at the University of Bristol. Or the science of learning. The science of learning is something that deserves our attention. Thank you, folks. Don't forget to share this video if you liked it and subscribe to the EDC Rocks YouTube channel. And stay tuned for more videos. Yes, that's right. I'm going to produce many more. Bye-bye, and I'll see you when I see you.